Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Curious Case of Science, where curiosity meets critical thinking. I'm your host, John Guy, author of Think Straight and Owner's Manual for the Mind, contributing author to the upcoming book Investigating Clinical Psychology, Pseudoscience, Fringe Science, and Controversies, and a frequent guest writer for thinkingispower.com, a wonderful website that's dedicated to teaching and learning all about critical thinking. In this episode, we've assembled an exceptional lineup of leading scientists and seasoned skeptics. They'll dive deep into a variety of facts and common myths surrounding vaccines, providing us all with a compelling, evidence-based perspective on the pivotal role vaccines play in preserving public health. And joining me today is my co-host, David Burke, who is no stranger to the world of scientific skepticism and vaccine controversies. And with that, I'll turn this over to David to introduce himself and bring on our first guest.
My name is Dave, and I am the director of the Vaccination Station, which is a non-profit organization that promotes vaccines and critical thinking and pretty much everything else in between. I also run a Facebook page and a website. Today, we'll be speaking with several doctors and scientists to debunk myths and discuss facts about vaccines and related issues. And our first speaker today will be Dr. Jonathan Howard. Dr. Howard is an associate professor of psychiatry and neurology at Bellevue Hospital and New York University. His fact is that vaccines are beneficial to children, and his myth is that COVID is harmless for children. Dr. Howard, I'll turn it over to you for your fact.
So the fact is that COVID vaccines are beneficial for children. The pediatric COVID vaccines were studied in 6 randomized controlled trials involving about 25,000 children. So that's not a small number of people to be involved in a randomized controlled trial. Since their approval, around 50 studies have informed us of the vaccine's safety and efficacy. As with the adult vaccine, the pediatric vaccine today in 2023 is not quite as effective as we hoped it would be when the original vaccine RCTs were done in 2021. However, there is copious evidence from around the world that the pediatric COVID vaccine has already protected countless children from rare but grave harms of COVID. It's not perfect. Vaccinated children, unfortunately, have died of COVID, and there are side effects. The vaccine can cause myocarditis in about 1 in 10,000 and in about 1 to 10,000, 1 to 15,000 adolescent males after their second vaccine dose, which essentially describes no children today. Though doctors who have treated this condition and publish on it universally describe it as almost always having a favorable prognosis. And the vaccine causes myocarditis at a much lower rate than COVID.
Before I pass it over to the others for discussion, I do have a question. If you can clarify what you mean by an observational study, how is that different to another type of study?
Sure. So a randomized controlled trial is considered the gold standard in medicine. They're the hardest, most expensive, time-consuming studies to do, and they certainly have limitations. But this is where about 3,000 to 4,000 children are enrolled in a vaccine trial. A coin is tossed, and half of the children get the vaccine and half of the children get a placebo. And you wait and follow them for several months, and you see who gets COVID and who doesn't. And in those vaccine RCTs, again, which are a little bit out of date, unfortunately, because new variants, the vaccine was 100% effective at stopping COVID in its tracks. Again, no one claims that the vaccines are that effective today. Observational trials are studies of data banks and CDC monitoring services, which sort of determine who is coming to the hospital, who is getting sick, who is dying of this. And it shows that it's overwhelmingly the unvaccinated children who are getting sick. Those studies aren't quite as pristine because occasionally there can be confounding things. I mean, maybe a certain type of parents are more likely to vaccinate their child than other types of parents. But when you have 25 to 30 studies all showing the exact same thing, the odds that this is due to chance alone or some confounding variable are essentially zero.
That is excellent. Thank you so much for that. Would anyone else like to weigh in, maybe add a little to what's been said already or clarify some further points for us?
So I'm on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. When we considered this vaccine back in December of 2020, we sort of set ourselves up in a sense that when you looked at those two trials of Pfizer and Moderna, you had basically 95% efficacy against all manner of symptomatic illness, mild, moderate, severe illness. There's no way that was going to last for mild illness. The reason it was so effective for mild illness early on was those were 3-month studies. I mean, virtually all of those participants had just gotten their second dose. This is a short incubation period mucosal infection. Protection against mild disease will not last for a long time. And what happened was 6 months later, exactly what you would have expected to have happened in July of 2021. Protection against severe disease was holding up very well, still in the 90+% range, but protection against mild disease had dropped to 50%, which you would have expected because antibodies, neutralizing antibodies, will fade over those 6 months, but you're still protected against serious disease, largely in part because of T cells. So this fact, even though we've gone from Wuhan to the Omicron variants now to sort of EG5 and BA286, what's happened is you still have conservation of T cell epitopes, so you're still protected against serious disease. And I really wish that we had explained this better, because the CDC really by mid-2020 started using the term breakthrough to describe mild illness. Bad word, it implies failure, and that wasn't a failure. It was exactly what you want. You want this vaccine to keep you out of the hospital and out of the intensive care unit and out of the morgue. It continues to do that.
So I have a question. What would you say to the naysayers who say now that that the vaccines don't protect against COVID at all? Like how would you approach that specific claim that we hear all the time?
I think you need to define what the goal of the vaccine is. The goal of the vaccine is to protect against serious disease, keep people out of the hospital. So this is true for any short incubation period mucosal infection like RSV or respiratory syncytial virus or influenza. You're not going to get protection against mild disease for very long. That's always true. So, but that's not the goal. I just think we need to make it very clear what is a reasonable, attainable goal. It's not an attainable goal to protect against all mild disease unless you're going to be boosting every few months, which we're not going to do because that's not a viable public health strategy. So define what is the goal of the vaccine. And we haven't been great at it. I agree.
I have two questions specific to children. The first is that for many parents, what they say is COVID just isn't dangerous enough for children to justify a vaccine. And the other question is that you often hear is, what if the child already had COVID? Do they still need to get vaccinated in addition?
I'll be discussing the first question is the myth that I'm going to be debunking. I think in terms of whether children who have had an infection benefit from vaccination, there are some studies, I'd have to look at them myself to remind myself exactly, showing that there is some benefit to vaccination after infection, at least in preventing disease, whether it meets sort of Dr. Offit's standards about, keeping people out of the hospital and that sort of thing. I personally haven't seen that sort of evidence that vaccination after infection is necessary to protect children, keeping them out of the hospital. So I think we're dealing with an unknown at this situation a little bit. I think the risks of the vaccine are relatively low, especially for younger children and for girls, that the risks outweigh the harm. I'm sorry, the benefits of the vaccine outweigh the risks, but reasonable people can differ about that. I think it's a gray area at this point.
I think that brings us on to our next section then. Dr. Howard, would you like to cover your myth then while we're on the subject, because we've pretty much been led to it by those last couple of points.
Sure.
And I think this is a good time to jump in and clarify. And Dr. Offit has mentioned mild disease, that the preventing mild disease is what we're hoping for, and keeping people out of the hospitals. There's been also some questions about what mild disease actually looks like and what mild actually means in practical terms, and how that's different to something that would keep you out of the hospital, or something that, as the anti-vaxxers argue, you don't even need a vaccine for. If it's only a mild disease, why do you need a vaccine? So if you would like to elaborate on that in your answer, that would be very helpful.
Sure. I don't know if I'm the arbiter of exactly what is mild and what isn't. I think it's easier to sort of say what is severe and what is not severe. And maybe I should have started with this as my fact rather than my myth, but at the start of the pandemic, as early as March 2020, it became dogma that children were spared serious disease, and doctors really helped spread this myth. While children, especially those without underlying conditions, do have a very low risk of COVID, especially compared to older adults and vulnerable people, there are 73 million American children, nearly all of whom have contracted COVID by now. And a small percentage of a large number can be a large number. So let's review what COVID has done to children. The numbers I'm about to give are inexact. There are sources of underestimating COVID's impact on children. There are sources of overestimating COVID's impact on children. But thus far, around 2,000 children have died. Around 200,000 children have been hospitalized. And depending on the variant, some of those children can be very sick, up to a third needing ICU level care and 5 to 6% needing mechanical ventilation. And rarely children have needed lung transplants, had strokes or amputations. So COVID can be a very serious disease for children. These children do all have natural, most American children do have natural immunity, as Dorit pointed out. But babies have by far the highest risk of COVID for all children, and they don't arrive with natural immunity. So 4 million Americans arrive every year without natural immunity. And though it's happily vanished for now, around 10,000 children have been infected by MIS, multisystem inflammatory disorder. And this usually affected healthy children who are in their elementary school years. This condition sends most children, around 80%, to the ICU, and around 80 children have died of this condition. And we still have a lot to learn about long COVID. I personally think there's more questions than answers. I'll read one study, it's 1 in 1,000 kids, and I'll read another study, it's 1 in 10 kids. So I think there's more questions than answers, but I think we have to be humble about long COVID, as well as the fact that there may be consequences to repeat COVID infections for developing brains, developing children, developing bodies. And COVID's impact on children exceeds or equals that of many other diseases for which we vaccinate children routinely. And most importantly, all of these numbers would have been much higher had we done nothing to protect children at the start of the pandemic. Had we allowed 73 million American children to contract COVID all at the same time in the spring and summer of 2020, as some people advocated, all of these numbers would have been much worse. So when people say, and we hear this all the time, more children died of XYZ than they died of COVID, that's largely because we protected children at the pandemic start. So the fact that we did a decent job of protecting children and we vaccinated millions of them before they contracted COVID was used, therefore, to argue that children didn't need protection at all. So again, the risk of a child who contracts COVID on an individual level is very low, but it's not zero. And low events multiplied tens of millions of times have added up to a significant burden for children.
I'm glad you mentioned that last point, because a popular comeback that we get from anti-vaxxers is, well, it's only harmed a very tiny percentage of children. It's only killed a very tiny number of children. And my response to that is, well, how many dead children is acceptable to you? It should be zero. That's what we should be all aiming for. And as you pointed out, Dr. Howard, the main reason why the impact was lessened was because we took precautions early, rapidly, to make sure that the risk was minimized across all demographics, across all age groups. So what we're actually seeing here is the result, the positive result of those efforts to curb the spread among young children, who, as we know, can act as disease vectors and infect older, more vulnerable people, say, for example, grandparents or older relatives they haven't seen for ages due to lockdown or whatever. So that's the other side of the child infection issue, that they can be carriers. And that's a significant problem for larger families, multi-generational families especially.
Yeah, I mean, the vaccines, again, it depends on the variant. Their ability to stop transmission is, again, much less than we had hoped, but it's not zero. And when you're dealing with a virus with exponential outbreak, any opportunity to prevent some onward transmission of the virus is a success. And I do wish that we could vaccinate children against drowning, car crashes, bullets. If I could protect my children from those three things with 2 or 3 safe injections, I absolutely would. But unfortunately, those are much harder to prevent. And except for guns, at least here in America, we go through much greater lengths to protect children from car crashes and from drownings. And no one blinks an eye at that. But it's only with COVID that we're told, it's just a small number, so what's the point? And that's what all anti-vaccine arguments really boil down to. And this is exactly, word for word, how anti-vaxxers talked about measles before the pandemic. So before the pandemic, a doctor who said, only 500 children died a year of measles would have rightly been thought of as a quack. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say. But now it's kind of mainstream to say, only 500 children die of COVID. What's the point? And I think it's really unfortunate that that kind of thinking has infiltrated mainstream medicine.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing, I completely agree with everything you just said. Our hospital, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, was overwhelmed with this virus in 2020. We had 3 floors of COVID. I mean, our intensive care unit was overflowing with weeks canceled, emergency, a variety of any kind of elective surgeries. And the main reason we were seeing kids suffer or be hospitalized or die was missing. I mean, this, where a child would have a fairly trivial infection, a month would go by, and then they would have fever, they would have evidence of heart, lung, liver, kidney involvement, especially heart involvement. And, I've never seen anything like it where we were that overwhelmed with the virus that we had to just basically, it was all hands on deck. And I just wish we had filmed that, filmed every bit of that so people could see how awful it was a mass unit. And when people say, how big of a deal is it? Only whatever, now 2,000 children have died. How can you possibly say that? It's just, it's not okay.
That's an interesting point. And I want to come back to something that Dr. Howard said about it depending on the variant, the severity depending on the variant. A question that I had for the panel was that what are the odds, or what are the chances that that SARS-CoV-2 could mutate to something that becomes more infectious, more transmissible in a different age demographic? Like in the Spanish flu pandemic, we know that it targeted a completely different age group. And what is, as long as SARS-CoV-2 exists now, is it possible that it mutates to something that has a completely different age demographic that it targets?
I'll start, if that's okay, and then turn it over to you guys. All viruses mutate. The question is, does this virus evolve to become more or less virulent? In terms of virulence, at least there was a study out of Hong Kong that was probably the best study of this, looking at people who had neither been naturally infected or vaccinated during Alpha Delta, compared to the people who had neither been naturally infected or vaccinated, which was hard in the Omicron era, up through at least through the BA 2, 3, 4, 5. And it looks like it is no less virulent. I mean, it is as virulent. But viruses can change. I mean, there are examples of viruses which are sort of particularly initially respiratory viruses that become enteric viruses. I mean, you see that in the animal kingdom world. So, I mean, it is possible. I mean, you would argue that the goal of the virus is to live, right? And so its goal is to be able to be transported or transferred from one person to the next. So it's never to the advantage of the virus to kill you. You would think that the perfect virus would be rhinovirus, right? It was very, very contagious, yet, doesn't kill people. But I don't think viruses think that way because they're actually not people, even though we anthropomorphize them. But I'll be curious to hear what you guys think.
I think the best thing is not to make predictions. Having written novels on predictions that age poorly, I think that's the smartest thing. And smart people admit their own errors, as Dr. Offit and I have both done at various times, and we stop making predictions about this virus. I mean, think about it. If any of us, Dr. Offit's the world's leading expert in vaccines. If he fell into a coma in March 2020 and awoke now, he'd be useless. He could be caught up to speed pretty quickly, but he'd be close to useless. No offense. It's just that this virus has behaved so unpredictably. I think. And who got it right throughout the pandemic? No one. So everyone stop making predictions and but I think we have to be humble. I think a lot of people approached this virus with a great arrogance in March and April of 2020, that we knew exactly how it was going to behave. I can find all of these statements that it was less deadly than the flu for children. And of course, people kept saying that as flu killed, one child in a year and COVID killed over 1,000. But I think we just have to approach the virus with some humility. And that is kind of what I said before, that we have to be humble about the idea that a child who is born today might be infected 10 times by the time they turn 20. And maybe that's going to have some effect, There's some, I don't want to fear monger and say, oh, they're all going to get Alzheimer's and it's going to be airborne AIDS. I'm not a fan of that. But, there's evidence that it can cause some diabetes and it can cause some lung scarring. So we just have to be humble, I think.
I think that betting on what a virus is going to do is often not a good bet. It's really hard to predict what it's going to do. But I think moving forward, what we should look for, rather than trying to make predictions, what we should look for is any one new variant going to evade immune memory granted by vaccination or infection, or is it going to evade our antivirals? Those are the things we want to look out for and be worried about most of the time, I think, because it's a given that the virus is going to mutate and try to get around our first line defenses, which are those neutralizing antibodies, to create more infections, which is, as Paul said, a virus's goal, to pass from one to another. So as long as our tools to keep people out of the hospital and keep people from getting seriously ill are still working, our antivirals, our immune memory, I don't think we really have to panic.
I just want to thank Dr. Howard for making a point that I think is greatly overlooked. Dr. Howard said that sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes doctors are wrong. Sometimes scientists are wrong. And he made also an observation about the need to approach new viruses, new information, evolving information with humility. And those are two things I have never seen from anti-vaxxers or the quacks and cranks who support them. I have never seen them admit I was wrong about XYZ, and I've never seen them approach any topic, particularly those completely beyond their scope, with any kind of humility. And to me, to have a doctor or a scientist say, I was wrong about such and such, or, well, we need to approach this with humility because we don't know everything, that is a mark of credibility and authenticity. And I think it has been greatly undervalued throughout this pandemic.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I completely agree with that. Our next speaker is Dr. Dorit Rice. She is the professor of law at UC San Francisco. Her fact today is going to be COVID vaccines went through an approval process very close to the process routine vaccines go through, with clinical trials just as large and with monitoring more extensive than other vaccines. And after that, her myth, what she's going to be talking about, is one that we've all heard many, many times, is that the FDA tried to hide trial data for 75 years, which if you've ever, tried to execute a public records request or FOIA request, that is complete nonsense. But I'm going to turn it over to Professor Rice and hear what she has to say.
So I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to focus on the regulatory side and let the other experts take up the science questions. The point I want to make is that, and I'm focusing only on the original vaccine at this point, it's been more complicated for the boosters, is that although there is a myth that a point of view that COVID-19 vaccines were rushed, and to some degree they went through an accelerated timeline. They went through the steps that other vaccines go through. They went through animal trials. They went through limited first phase trials, just as other vaccines go through. And when they got to human trial, the human trials were just as large, probably larger than most routine vaccines. I'm going to just mention the mRNA vaccines, since those are the one most commonly used now. Pfizer had over 43,000 participants in their trial. Moderna had over 36,000. Those are very large trials. And they tried to go for a high percentage of people who are elderly, since that's the virus target, high percentage of people of color, and high percentage of people with comorbidities, although of course it's not always easy and you can have limited success. And I want to remind everybody that after authorization, and emergency authorization is not licensing. The requirements in theory are less demanding, although in this case, the FDA did demand pretty close to what they would demand for licensing, a shorter time period, but pretty close to what they demand. After the authorization, I want to remind everyone that the monitoring was as close, probably closer than we have for routine vaccines. That includes keeping in place the 4 monitoring system we have in the United States. And remember, other countries have their own monitoring system. I'm focusing on the United States because I know it better, but every country, every developed country at least, has several systems in place to monitor this. In the United States, we have the passive reporting system of the vaccine adverse events reporting system. We have the more active monitoring by the Vaccine Safety Data Link and by the Sentinel Initiative. We have the more specialized monitoring of CISA. And for COVID-19 vaccine, CDC created a new real-time monitoring system, vSafe, in which they sent people text messages and got feedback on how they're doing after the vaccine. So in other words, COVID-19 vaccines went through as thorough a process as other vaccines, and were monitored closer. The Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices of the CDC met in those first months about every month and reviewed the data, reviewed reports from the data in detail, and examined closely what was going on. That's how we caught the very rare adverse events that came up. We knew from the start that there were allergic reaction. We knew from the start that there were, well, not from the start. We found out relatively quickly that there were serious clots issues with the J&J vaccines. And although it took a little longer, we learned about myocarditis for young, especially men, but not only men, from the mRNA vaccine.
Thank you, Professor Rice. I especially liked what you said about the heightened regulatory requirements. I think in an article you wrote, you call it the EUA plus, which was just the same regulatory requirements as other vaccines, but there's a little bit more. And that's something that I think is often missed when we talk about this. And we have vSafe. We added a ton of different regulations that was going to be required, I think, because we had so much public focus on this, and we have a pandemic going on in 2020, which is different than anything we've ever encountered, because we have social media and we have, access to instant information. And one of the things you mentioned was finding out about myocarditis and those different adverse events that came up after that. And that's one of the things that I'd like the panel to discuss is the process of discovery. It's not something new, and it's not something that was hidden. I'd like to see what the panel has to say about that in particular.
I'd like to follow up on what you said, and I do want to make one point clear so that I'm not overstating something. When observers had concerns about an EUA process at the beginning, they had real concerns because the EUA requirements are much less demanding than the requirement for licensure. I'm simplifying. There are 4 conditions, but essentially all you need is to show that the given evidence suggests that the risks are outweighed by the benefits. There's not real requirement for clinical human trials in the law that allows emergency use authorization. As you mentioned, the FDA went beyond that. The EUA plus is a term they use, not a term I added, and they intentionally said we're going to demand more than that. And Dr. Offit, for example, spoke before that to remind them that they should, in fact, be careful in overseeing these vaccines, because there was, in fact, a real concern that the vaccine will be subject to less stringent requirement. That just didn't happen. Now I'll let the panel follow up on your point.
If I could just add one thing about why these vaccine trials did go pretty quickly, I think there's 2 important reasons. The first of these is that people were beating down the door to get in, right? So I was in a vaccine trial, the AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm very British, but that's unusual. It can be very hard to recruit patients into randomized controlled trials. That wasn't true for these vaccine trials. That's number one. Number two is you have to understand how these trials were designed. They were called, I think, event-driven trials, meaning what they did is they gave, as Professor Rees said, about 20,000 people the vaccine and about 20,000 people placebo. And they said, we're going to wait until we get 150 to 200 cases of COVID. And that didn't take very long. Had they used this trial design for an HIV vaccine, for example, it would have taken years. But the fact that these trials took such a very short time showed how contagious COVID was, even in the spring or summer and fall of 2020 when these trials were going on. And also, I guess the third point is that mRNA technology wasn't brand new. I think the vaccines were actually designed within like a week or so, something like that. It took them longer to test. But scientists weren't starting from scratch. So I think all of those three reasons explain why the vaccine trials went very quickly. And people sometimes forget that the design of the trials, these studies were designed to end, not after a certain amount of time, but after a certain amount of people contracted COVID, and not very many people. They only let 150 or 200 people get COVID before they wisely decided to look at the results and stop it.
In a sense, as you're saying, we benefited from the fact that things were bad in spring and summer 2000, that a lot of people were getting sick. So we had people get sick relatively quickly. But the fourth thing that might be worth putting on the table, I completely agree with what you said, is government money. The government put a lot of money into these trials, which allowed manufacturers to move to these large, very costly trials at a time they probably wouldn't have without that funding. One of the things that slows us is, and Dr. Offit can probably speak to that better, is that manufacturers won't invest hundreds of thousands or billions of dollars in a trial unless they think there's a good chance they'll win. When it's the government money, they were a lot more willing to do that.
Sorry, I'm just saying the government took the risk out of pharmaceutical companies. I mean, basically they pay to mass produce the vaccine before you finish the clinical trials. I would say one thing, because when this came up in our committee, I always really didn't like the term emergency use authorization, because the term emergency implied that there were corners that were being cut, especially regarding safety. And that wasn't true. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that created the rotavirus vaccine. But the difference between that vaccine, which took 26 years to develop, not 11 months, was, what you do when you license a product is that you don't just license the product, you also license the process by which the product is made and the building in which the product is made. And so what will happen is that you get licensed. In order for licensure to happen, those things all have to be in place. Well, that was really going on in real time. So it wasn't that different really in terms of certainly what the final product was. But by using that term, we created this notion that there was a vaccine that was approved through emergency use authorization. Then these same vaccines were ultimately licensed, and there was a feeling among the general public that those were two different products when obviously they weren't. So I think we did that to ourselves to some extent.
Yeah, I remember the discussions between anti-vaxxers and science communicators that they were trying to explain that Comirnaty was the same vaccine. It wasn't a different thing entirely. And but that's a good segue, I think, to Professor Rice's myth, which is that the FDA tried to hide trial data for 75 years. Now, if there's some malicious cabal of conspirators that include pharmaceutical companies who are competing with each other, but yet colluding with themselves and the government to hide data, I think that myth is quite far off. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor Rice to discuss it.
What happened here is an anti-vaccine group filed a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, for the full clinical data from the trial. As a reminder, when the FDA authorized the vaccine, it published a lengthy report about them that included a lot of the data from the trial. What they didn't do is publish the raw data, and there's two reasons to hesitate to publish that. One is trade secrets for the company. While we might say, well, we don't care that much about that, companies do. And if we want companies to be making these products, we need to offer them some protection that will preserve their product at least for a while. The other concern is the privacy of the people in the trial. So when the anti-vaccine group asked for the data, FDA couldn't just turn it over without hesitation. They have to go through it and erase private data and erase things that are trade secrets. The problem is that agencies don't prioritize FOIA requests, probably with some justification. It's one of the things they do. There's usually a limited number of people assigned to do FOIA requests, and there's almost always more FOIA requests in time. And what the anti-vaccine people asked for was really, really broad. So the FDA came back after they sued and said, look, we can give you this data. We will give you this data. It will take us time to go through it and redact the things we need to redact. Given our other FOIA requests and the things we have and the personnel we have, it will take us, we can do this number of pages a month. You ask for 300,000 pages, that will take a while. But you can tell us what you want first. Give us your priorities. We'll start releasing the data immediately with, first of all, the things you want first. The anti-vaccine people were unhappy and described this as the FDA is refusing to release data for 75 years. Since they were ready to release data immediately, that was obviously not accurate. They just said it will take us time. And there are other people with requests. The FDA ended up before a judge, the anti-vaccine people brought the case and ended up before a judge that was sympathetic to their views and that ordered the agency to release the data on a much faster timeline. This has disadvantages. The disadvantage is that it means that other people who filed for a request are going to have the request delayed and that the FDA will have to invest more, whether by removing people and money from other places or by asking Congress for more people and money, which Congress tends not to give for a request. So the data is being released. I will add that the anti-vaccine people so far have been very clearly misrepresenting the data. For example, by presenting the reports released as if they show causation in cases where they don't, saying, look, Pfizer is showing us that after the vaccine was released, 12,000 people died, and they say it's because of the vaccine, whereas all that it reports is that 12,000 people died, not 12,000, 1,200 people died from various causes. So the data, as expected, is being misrepresented by the anti-vaccine people, but what is also misrepresented is that the answer that there will be a delay in release was some kind of conspiracy, whereas it really reflects lack of resources and other priorities. I will add that anyone who has filed a FOIA request with an agency will know that they're not quick and not very cooperative in releasing them. So there is a need for supervision by the court, and there are a lot of cases where agencies try to stonewall. But this doesn't look like that. They were willing to release the data immediately, but it would take them time to go through the large number of pages and release all of it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm one of those people that have been involved in a number of public records requests. And even if you could take it on an anecdotal level as well, but even if you dig into the case law, that is a giant portion of the complaints is that the agencies are extremely reluctant to release records. And whether that's, because they have to take time to redact them or because they don't like the nature of the person who requested it or whatever have you, the case law is completely filled with that exact same complaint, which is not surprising. And like you said, they didn't do that here. They said they're willing to release it, but there's proprietary information in there. There's patient information in there that needs to be combed through and redacted. And it's a really careful process because if it ultimately comes on them to protect the rights of patients and corporations to make sure that information isn't released. If they do accidentally release that information, then there's a whole nother problem that they would have to deal with. I wanted to ask you a question that you said earlier that I think is relevant to a lot of the stuff that I hear from anti-vaxxers is that, well, at the time, if my memory is correct, that the FOIA, they only had 12 people dedicated to processing those requests at the time. And you said that Congress can't just give them money and people. Can you clarify what you mean by Congress cannot do that?
Congress can do that. So the FDA said they had about 10 people working on FOIA requests. Congress just usually doesn't. it is a reality of the administrative states that agencies tend to be underfunded and understaffed, at least in the United States. I'm not saying it might not be true elsewhere, but by and large, Congress tends to give agencies more to do than people and money to do that. And although Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act and passed amendments that made it stronger in the 1990s, Congress did not provide agencies with additional money to handle Freedom of Information requests, which is why, although it's really frustrating when they stall on this, from their point of view, this is another thing they need to do. And for many people who go into the agency, it's not their core focus. It should be, but it's not. So Congress can give the money, but Congress is very unlikely to do that. It's not a priority for Congress either.
It strikes me that the FOIA request is very much a performative act by anti-vaxxers. Obviously, we know they're not really trying to dig into secret stuff that they hope will blow everything out of the water. And the deliberate way they go about the process is very telling. Firstly, they put in an unreasonably large request for an enormous volume of documents that they know is going to bog down the agency and cause incredible delays. The moment the delay starts to drag on, they go, there you go, they're trying to slow down the process and hide it. So they go to court and they go, we'll try and force you to release it faster through the courts. Then you just say, maybe they get a sympathetic judge who says, yeah, release it faster or whatever. They claim that it was a win. And they say, there you go. That's proof that they were trying to hide it. We managed to force them into court and make them release it faster. Then, of course, the agency says, due to legal considerations, we need to redact some information. And that's the next thing they can go to. They go, so now they're covering up some of this stuff. We specifically asked to see, how do we know that the stuff that's being covered up isn't the dodgy stuff that they meant to be telling us? And so it goes on. Every time a request is met, they are able to spin it into some new way to make it look like a negative. And all of this is simply done really for propaganda purposes. There's no good faith argument behind any of this.
I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, I think you're right that they're cynically misusing the process, that they're willing to misrepresent, but don't underestimate the belief of conspiracy theories in the grand conspiracy. In other words, you're right that they are more than willing to misrepresent results. They're more than willing to abuse the process, but I think they do believe that there is a grand conspiracy to harm, and that they think if they just get enough of the data, they might actually find it.
Yeah, and to what Dave was saying too is it's a lot of it is just for show. They make requests for things like RCTs of placebo-controlled trials of new vaccines, just to have them say that we don't have them, just so they can use it for their propaganda purposes, to say, see, they never did RCTs with placebo-controlled trials on this particular vaccine, when that's not even something that we do. And I want to pass this on now to Dave to introduce his next guest.
Thanks, John. Well, our next guest is Dr. Vicky Mail. Dr. Mail is a senior lecturer in reproductive immunology at Imperial College London. Her fact is that the use of flu vaccines in pregnancy has been tested in randomized controlled trials, and her myth is that in trials, 82% of people who received the COVID vaccine during pregnancy lost their babies. So over to you, Dr. Mail.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, and I'm so glad to get to follow Dorit, because actually I'm going to be picking up on a lot of things that she said. So I'm going to start with my fact, which is that the use of flu vaccines in pregnancy has been tested in randomized controlled trials. And 2 of these have been done, both part of the Mother's Gift Project, which is a set of trials that aim to look at the safety and effectiveness of various different kinds of vaccination in pregnancy. And they particularly focus on how vaccination in pregnancy can protect babies after they're born. So there have been 2 published studies, one in 2008 in The Lancet. Sorry, as you can hear, I'm a little bit respiratory infected myself at the moment. And there's been a secondary analysis of that same data set in 2012. And that was quite a small trial. There were 340 participants in Bangladesh. They were looking at flu vaccine versus a pneumococcus vaccine. And they found no difference in severe adverse events. And among mothers and babies, there was a reduction in flu-like illness of about 30% and a reduction in confirmed influenza of 63%. And then they did another one, a bigger trial, came out in the Lancet Infectious Diseases in 2017, which had almost 3,700 participants in Nepal, and that trial was flu vaccine versus saline. The pregnancy outcomes were similar in the two groups, and the vaccine was about 20% effective against flu-like illness and 30% effective against laboratory-confirmed influenza. And in the past, observational studies, which Dr. Howard has really nicely introduced us to, have found that flu vaccine reduces the chance of having a low birth weight baby. But as he mentioned, we always have to be really careful with observational studies because sometimes people who make an effort to get vaccinated are taking care of their health in other ways. But what was interesting was that both of these trials, which let's not forget are randomized, they also found a reduction in low birth weight of 50% in the Bangladeshi trial and 15% in the Nepali trial. So this is all really good to know, and it's exactly the sort of thing that if you were pregnant during the flu season, your doctor or midwife would tell you about. So why have I chosen to talk about something that's so boring? Well, it's because I've recently heard claims that go something like, we made a Freedom of Information request to the FDA asking them to provide all the clinical trials that they relied upon to license the flu vaccine for pregnant women, and they admitted to us that no such trials had been done. And when I heard that claim, I thought, well, that's really weird because there are these two clinical trials. But as Dorit has kind of already brought up, what seems to be happening here is the way that the request has been made. In short, it's been made under the Freedom of Information Act, which is a way to get hold of unreleased or uncirculated information and documents that in the USA, although it's really similar here as well, are controlled by the US government or by a state or by another public authority. So if you make a request using a Freedom of Information request, you're just not going to turn up these trial reports because they're not unreleased, they've been published, and they're also not controlled by the US government. And actually, if you go and look up the response to this FOI request, which I have, the FDA don't say to the people who made the request, there are no trials. They actually just say, we have no unreleased records of these trials that we can release to you in response to this request.
That is brilliant, because that is another point that I've seen them make, or another argument I've seen them make, that we put in this request for this information. They said they didn't have it, and so obviously the implication is these trials were never done. But what they're doing is obscuring the nature of the process and the nature of the request to pretend that there's something dodgy going on. So yeah, the government can't release documentation that's already in the public domain.
I want to add to this as the legal person here. As Dr. Mail so nicely put it, what FOIA does is allow you to have access to agency records. A trial, whether published or not, isn't usually an agency record. It's just the same is true for scientific studies. What the agencies do is go into the computer, make a search for a certain thing, and if an agency record come up with the right word, then they can give it to you. Anything that's, whether it's published or not, if it's not an agency record, it's not going to come up in a FOIA request. And using that to say there's no such thing is simply either misunderstanding FOIA or more likely for these very experienced people lying about it.
We're wising up to this a little bit in the UK, and I've been involved in a couple of Freedom of Information requests in the UK where the agency knew that they didn't hold the data because it wasn't their data, because it was something like, you know, we want to see the studies that have been done on the safety of COVID vaccination in pregnancy. And actually, they've started to wise up a little bit, and they'll say, well, we hold no records that are relevant to your claim. But by the way, it might be useful to you to look at this information that's in the public domain. And I sometimes help put together the public domain information for them, hopefully to kind of head that misuse of Freedom of Information requests off at the pass.
Could I ask one quick question, Dr. Mail? I'd love your comment on this. What was unique to me about sort of COVID vaccines and pregnancy was typically when companies make a vaccine, assuming they're not making a maternal vaccine, they'll avoid pregnant people during those trials. and which was true here. I mean, for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, I think there were 36 pregnancies that occurred during those trials, even though they didn't want pregnant people in those trials because life finds a way. So in any case, that's all, just 36 days. So nonetheless, normally when trials are done, and it doesn't include pregnant people, the ACIP, Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, will say that the vaccine is contraindicated for use in pregnancy. They didn't do that here. What they said was, because they knew you had a 2 to 3-fold increased chance of being hospitalized or dying from COVID if you were infected as a pregnant person than a person of the same age who wasn't pregnant. They said that a woman could reasonably choose, a person could reasonably choose to get this vaccine. And then through the VSafe program, once tens of thousands of people, pregnant people, were immunized and they saw that it was safe, then they basically had an urgent recommendation for people, pregnant people, to get vaccinated. But I'd never seen it play out that way before, where despite the fact you had no data, the CDC basically said, sure, you could reasonably do that if you want. I'd never seen that before. Did that surprise you?
I had also not seen it done like that before. There have been a couple of cases where we have public health emergencies that particularly are of concern during pregnancy, and there in the past, or we have just begun to prioritize including pregnant people in clinical trials. So for example, Zika virus trials. Yes, Zika virus, but I meant to say Ebola virus there because that's particularly risky if you're pregnant. And I think it was really interesting view that the CDC took when they made that sort of, not recommendation, but they said, do you know what? Here's the information, you can make a decision. And we will, of course, collect as much information as we can in observational studies to tell us as soon as we can find out if there's a problem with this. And Israel actually did something similar. And as it happens, it was the right decision. And as someone who's neither from the USA or from Israel, I really thank you for doing that, because we used your data to make our recommendations 3 months later. And I think under the circumstances, it was probably a reasonable thing to do. But you're right, I don't really know a kind of precedent of doing it quite as quickly as it was done without clinical trials.
Well, I have a question for Dr. Mail, and I know Dr. Offit has written about this before, but what is, I guess I have kind of two questions, is this information that they have been requesting for the COVID-19 vaccine trials, is this information typically released to the public, as a kind of a perfunctory manner? And if it's not, why do you think they're asking for it now?
We were talking about flu vaccines. We will actually go on to talk about COVID vaccines. I don't actually know particularly in the US of any, actually I do. In some ways, shall I move on to talk about my myth? Because this will actually be quite relevant, I think, to what you've asked me, because people have been saying that in the trials, 82% of people who received the COVID vaccine during pregnancy lost their babies. And that's not actually coming from an FOI request, but it has been repeated as a result of an FOI request. So I'm just going to move on to my myth then, or rather I'm going to move on to the facts that go with the myth. So as Dr. Offit mentioned, we have pregnancy data actually from 2 randomized control trials of the Pfizer vaccine. And in the main trial, participants were asked not to become pregnant, but these are big trials, and I love that phrase, life finds a way. So some people became pregnant unintentionally.
It's Jurassic Park, by the way. Jeff Goldblum.
I'm not so young that I don't know Jurassic Park, but I've never heard it used, quite in the context of accidental pregnancy data from trials. So I think that's great. I'm going to use that now. I've previously been saying accidents happen, is what I used to say, but life finds a way. Life finds a way. And these people became pregnant unintentionally, and obviously, therefore, they'd been vaccinated very early in their pregnancies before they knew that they were pregnant. And in the Pfizer trial, the big one, among the participants who became pregnant, the pregnancy loss rate was 15% in the placebo group and 7% in the vaccine group. So actually a little bit less in the vaccine group than the placebo group, but those are not significantly different. And they're also not any different from the normal miscarriage rate, which is between 12 and 18%. And a lot of people actually don't realize that the normal miscarriage rate is quite that high, which can cause, confusion in itself. And there was actually a second later trial that specifically recruited participants who were between 24 and 34 weeks pregnant. And that data has actually just within the last month or so been posted in summary. But no one in either the vaccine or the placebo group lost their baby. And it's also worth saying that all the other pregnancy and baby outcomes that they looked at in that trial were the same. So where is this claim of 82% pregnancy loss in the trials coming from? It's clearly not coming from the trials. I've just told you what the numbers there, and they're nowhere near 82%. They're normal. And actually it comes from a misinterpretation of spontaneous reporting data. And spontaneous reporting is something that we do after the trials in the general rollout. So there's not going to be a control group in the spontaneous reporting data. Everyone's getting vaccinated. And the aim there is if we've got a safety problem that is really rare, too rare to have seen in trials. So Dorit mentioned, for example, the vaccine-induced thrombosis with adenovirus vectored vaccines or myocarditis with mRNA vaccines. Then by asking people who have received the vaccine in the general rollout to report if something happens to them, we might be able to spot that. And actually it works really well for this. But it works much less well for detecting increases in the rates of events that are common anyway, like, for example, miscarriage, which I've told you happens in 12 to 18% of pregnancies. And if we look at the numbers, you'll see why. So by February of 2021, about 48,000 people had been vaccinated in pregnancy worldwide, most of those in the United States of America. And of those 48,000, 26 had reported that they'd had a pregnancy loss after they were vaccinated. So taking those figures at face value, that's a pregnancy loss rate of 0.05%, which is about 1,000 times lower than the normal pregnancy loss rate. So from that, we would say, wow, it seems like vaccination really actively reduces the rate of pregnancy loss. But if we stop and we think for a minute, we might think, well, that's not very likely. What's more likely is that something that's very common anyway, even if that happens straight after you're vaccinated, you might well not report it. It's common anyway, you think it's probably not linked. And this is why we need to compare rates in vaccinated and unvaccinated populations, like in those two trials that I was talking about, but we can also do observational studies that achieve something similar. But this still doesn't tell us where this figure of 82% has come from. And in fact, it comes from taking all reports made about people who were vaccinated while they were pregnant and who reported a pregnancy outcome, which was a total of 32, and saying, well, 82% of those reports were of a pregnancy loss. But this doesn't include people who made a report but were still pregnant. There are about 250 of those, and they were mostly reporting things like, oh, I've got a sore arm, I've got a fever. And it also doesn't include the vast majority of the 48,000 people who didn't make a report at all. So this actually was published as part of the FDA's routine reporting into this, but it was also published again as part of the FOI request that Naomi Wolf and her team have been kind of making and looking through and misanalyzing, I would say, in the way that I've just described. But from this, I'd like to take two lessons. And the first is that you just can't calculate rates from spontaneous reporting. I've shown you two ways with this specific data where we try to calculate a rate, and both of them give us nonsense results, although for vastly different reasons. But more broadly, I think the lesson from this is if something sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, then it probably is. And I think we can inoculate ourselves against a lot of errors of thinking just by trying to remember that principle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mao. That was a beautifully concise explanation of quite a complex issue. So I really appreciate that. Does anyone else have something they would like to add to this?
First of all, I love the phrase "too bad to be true." I've never heard that before. I love it. I'm going to use it.
Dr. Mayo, can you just teach us a little bit about the post-marketing studies of the COVID vaccine in pregnancy, and are the and the risks of COVID to pregnant ladies?
Yeah, so I understand that because I remember seeing the discussion topics that someone's going to be talking about this in a lot of detail in general. So I'm going to not talk too much about spontaneous reporting for generally, But I do want to mention the studies that have been done specifically into the safety of COVID vaccination, as you said, kind of post-marketing. And these are observational. So some of the points that you made earlier, we do have to take into account, people who take their doctor or their midwife's advice to go get vaccinated, maybe doing other things to take care of their health. One of the ways that I love that some of the best studies control for that is they say, okay, well, did you go and get your whooping cough vaccine? Because did you go and get your whooping cough vaccine is an amazing control for, do you have a doctor and midwife who's talked to you about this? Are you proactively looking after your own health? And so this is really nice control. So we do our best to control in observational studies, but we always have to take them with a grain of salt. And there are now 38 observational studies that have been done across 10 countries, including more than 370,000 people who have either been vaccinated or boosted during pregnancy. And in total, these studies find no increased risk of any pregnancy problems, so pregnancy loss, either early or late, congenital abnormalities, any health problems in the babies when they're born, and some studies actually even follow the babies up until they're 6 months old. No evidence of any health problems in the babies happening at a greater rate in the vaccinated than in the control group. And what was quite interesting was when all of these studies were put together to try and see, so it's about as effective against all disease and severe disease in pregnancy as it is in the general population, which is kind of expected, but good to know. But what was really interesting is that a meta-analysis of not all of these studies, because some of them were published after the meta-analysis, that was published in Nature Communications, the first author was Prasad, found that actually there was a 15% reduction in stillbirths among the people who got vaccinated. Now, this is almost a case of, if it's too good to be true, you might not believe it, because a 15% reduction is a lot. But there was a suggestion that because we know that COVID infection in pregnancy can cause stillbirth, some of this effect at least might be genuine. And to me, I think the stronger evidence that COVID vaccination prevents COVID stillbirth is that there was a really big review that looked at all the cases of COVID stillbirth, tried to find all the cases of COVID infection where a stillbirth happened. And none of those in the whole literature was in someone who had been vaccinated.
I was going to say that there have been no randomized controlled trials of SARS-CoV-2 itself. So everything that we know about the virus comes from observational data. So observational data is not useless.
True, absolutely. But I think we need to, particularly when we're talking to people who might be trying to think quite hard, I think we need to acknowledge the limitations of all of our data, because I think that's really important for building trust.
Absolutely.
Dr. Mail, am I correct in remembering that maternal vaccination with the COVID-19 vaccines during pregnancy also yielded a reduction in COVID-related NICU or PICU stays for the first 6 months of life?
Yes, it absolutely did. And the extent to which that was true varies a lot by study. And it varies basically by the more, as we go through time, and we have different variants to contend with, and there's the difference between being completely unvaccinated and vaccinated versus the difference between vaccinated and boosted. All of those things make differences, but kind of in general ballpark figure, you're looking at something on the order of a 40 to 60% effectiveness against severe disease / hospitalization in babies if their mothers were vaccinated during pregnancy.
Thank you again, Dr. Mail. I will now pass over to John to bring in our next speaker.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Dr. Mail. That was a wonderful summary. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Daniel Wilson, who is a senior associate scientist. He has a PhD in biological science from Carnegie Mellon University. And for his fact, he's going to be talking about vaccines do not contain contaminants from cells, bacteria used to make them. And he's going to cover for his myth, phase 3 trials are the best way to test a vaccine safety. So I will thank you for being here, Dr. Wilson, and pass the mic over to you.
Hey, thanks, John. So yeah, the fact for today is that biologics like vaccines and other drugs do not contain contaminants from their manufacturing process. So in order to manufacture a biologic, let's take insulin, for example. It's a biological molecule. You need living things to create it. So for insulin, you can create it using bacteria. Now, if you're going to take insulin and put it into a diabetic patient, you probably don't want anything from the actual bacteria left over in that product, or else you could get negative things happening. So in manufacturing of insulin, there are very strict guidelines that need to be met in order for the product to be okay for human use. And that means making sure there are no host cell proteins. So no proteins are left over from the bacteria. No endotoxins are left over from the bacteria. No genetic material is there. You just want the drug substance as much as possible. And that applies, those rules all apply to vaccines as well. It's a very strict standard in pharmaceutical science called good manufacturing procedures. And so when it comes to vaccines, again, you need living things or biological systems to create them most of the time, whether you're using a inactivated pathogen, a attenuated pathogen, or a subunit or mRNA vaccine, whatever it may be, you need things to produce it. So in making sure that those products are good for use during the manufacturing process and approval process, and during the rollout process, every single batch is going to be tested to make sure that there are no high levels of protein, no high levels of DNA, no high levels of anything that is from the manufacturing process itself left over in the actual drug product. That's the reality, but anti-vaxxers have often found ways to misrepresent or ignore this fact. So for a long time, people have been worried about stuff left over from the cells used to produce certain vaccines being in the vaccines, particularly certain religious groups being very against certain vaccines that might use particular cell lines. But they don't really understand or don't acknowledge that there is a lot that goes into making sure that none of that stuff is left over in the actual vaccine product. Specifically, for example, the World Health Organization and the US Food and Drug Administration recommends that 10 nanograms per dose of DNA and 200 base pairs be the limit of content and size of residual DNA in a final product. Just to give you an idea of what 10 nanograms is, that's basically trace amounts. That's not going to do anything biologically active when it's left over in a vaccine product. So let's take the example of, they were first testing amounts of 3 micrograms of mRNA vaccine in this age group. And they were finding that the immune response wasn't exactly up to par of what they wanted to, what they were expecting. So they had to up the dose in order to get them eventually approved for that age group. So that's 3 micrograms. That's almost 1,000 times what this 10 nanogram per dose limit is. And that wasn't doing enough. So everything was there designed to have 3 micrograms of that vaccine stimulate an immune response, work properly, and it wasn't really doing it because it wasn't enough. Reduce that 1,000-fold, and you get the limits that the FDA has set. So it's trace amounts. It's not going to really do much. But still, again, anti-vaxxers today are recycling these kinds of claims for COVID vaccines, saying that they aren't properly tested to make sure that their contents are not containing contaminants, but they are. So in my day-to-day job, I see a lot of the good manufacturing procedures at work. We do qPCR to test for residual DNA in our products. We do a whole host of assays to test for other contaminants, including ELISAs, including HBLC, etc. We want to make sure that our products are below the limits. And the interesting thing is that when we do get to late stage processes of manufacturing and we're testing drug products, we're testing drug substances, and we see that there are high levels of host cell proteins or host cell DNA, we have to stop and do an investigation and figure out what the problem is, how to address it, and fix it ultimately in order to get that product moved forward. So there are people who are saying otherwise, but if you ask them to actually quantify their data and say, how much DNA actually did you find in whatever vaccine you're testing, or any question like that, they probably won't be able to answer you. So that's the fact that these GMP regulations have a long history and have been in place for a long time, and they are very strict.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I have a follow-up question, because a lot of the conversations always turn to their being, these regulatory agencies are in cahoots with the people who they're supposed to be testing the product of, or the government, or whoever. Who exactly is testing these vaccines for contaminants, and is it possible that they pencil whip the data, or are there multiple independent regulatory agencies that take a look into this?
Yeah, so it's lots of people. Most of the time, pharmaceutical companies will have contract research organizations, CROs, do some of the work for them. And the FDA actually likes to see that a CRO did the work that the pharmaceutical company also did, and they both got similar results. And then beyond that, for example, with COVID vaccines, when they're shipped out to other countries for them to administer to their populations, they might have their own regulatory agencies that have their own laboratories that they go to do that testing. And they better get the same results that other countries and other pharmaceutical companies are getting, or else there's going to be a problem. And that's what we see. We see that all over the world. The regulatory limits are met, and that these vaccines are administered to the public without any major issues arising. So if there were a conspiracy to cover up contaminants in the vaccines, it would be a massive one.
And presumably available to access through FOIA requests.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add one thing to what Dr. Wilson said, which is your question went to the question of collaboration between regulators and agencies, and there is some concern about that. Sometimes, especially in highly specialized areas, you see regulators moving into industry after, or industry members moving into regulators. But more concerning than that is probably the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, regulators tend to be understaffed and underfunded, which means that scope is a problem. There's a lot going on, and they might not be able to get to everyone. But as Dr. Wilson pointed out, one of the answers to that is the redundancy of oversight mechanisms that we have. One regulator can certainly fail to catch an issue, whether through capture, whether through lack of a scope. But when you go from country to country, and when you look at the time horizon, the view that a big issue will be missed becomes a lot less convincing. You might miss something at the margin, but with the same vaccine going to different countries, and even within the countries, different regulators. In the United States, we have 51 states. So although the oversight is federal, there's a lot of sites and a lot of people involved. So cover-up is going to be, if you think the government is that organized, then maybe they should have done a lot better on a lot of other things that they're doing really badly on. If they can do this, why aren't they doing simpler things?
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote from Stephen Hawking, who said that if the government is hiding evidence of alien activity, then they seem to be doing a better job at that than they are at anything else.
Yeah, and just to further address the point of this idea of industry capture or regulatory capture, a lot of anti-vaxxers seem to think that is happening because they see people trading positions from a regulatory agency to a pharma company and back and forth or what have you. But the reality is that pharmaceutical companies don't exactly enjoy working with the FDA. They might be called a pain in the butt to a lot of people because they're sticklers. You always get dinged for stuff. You always get comments back. You always get nitpicked. It's like submitting a paper in academia and getting reviewer number 2's comments back. It's always really annoying. So And on top of that, most drugs don't really make it very far in development, because either it becomes clear to the pharmaceutical company that it's not going to pass regulatory standards, and so it's terminated early, or they submit to a regulatory agency and they are denied a new drug application, which happens a fair amount of the time. So if there's such widespread regulatory capture going on, you wouldn't expect that to happen, but it does.
Can I ask one question, Dan? Because I think you make the relevant point that the dose makes the poison, but nonetheless, there's this tremendous sort of sense of chemophobia in this country, where it's simply the mention of a chemical name, whether it's an activating agent or a buffering agent or stabilizing agent or emulsifier, even though it's at trace quantities which you would typically encounter every day, assuming you eat food on this planet or drink water or anything made from water on this planet. It's still hard to get people to do them. Ethyl mercury, the thimerosal, and there was in vaccines, is a perfect example of that. I mean, mercury never sounds good, even though you're drinking mercury every day, assuming that you're living on this planet. So how do you get to that? How do you compellingly tell people that what they're exposed to is safe?
Yeah, well, it's difficult. It is the real answer. It's difficult to get people who are chemophobic to really think about and understand where their concerns are coming from. But when it comes to more recent claims with COVID vaccines, and there being claims of DNA, high levels of DNA in them, which there is not, but I try to ask the question, okay, you're worried about this DNA, which again is in tiny fragments, because the DNA before the drug substance is made is chopped up by enzymes during the manufacturing process. So it's all in really tiny fragments. So, okay, you're worried about really tiny fragments in very low quantities. Are you worried about encountering DNA viruses on a daily basis? Are you worried about consuming DNA in fruits and vegetables that you eat? Why aren't you? And if not, why? Because the same logic would lead you to be very concerned and panicked about all of that DNA your body encounters on a regular basis, and not this trace amounts of chopped up DNA that might be in a biologic. It doesn't make any sense.
I know. I also never understood why it is when people were afraid of this sort of genetic vaccine, because it's really the mRNA vaccines and the adenovirus vector vaccines are genetic vaccines, different from what we've had, that people worry it's going to alter your genome, but it was always altering it for the bad. I mean, why can't it alter it so you can develop superpowers or something? And nobody ever sort of made that point.
Yeah. No, I still don't have magnetic powers.
Well, thank you, Dan, for the clarification on that. I'd like to move on to your myth now that phase 3 trials are the best way to test vaccine safety. Can you tell us why that is?
Yeah, so we've kind of talked about it a little bit already, but just to delve into it, I think this is an important issue because, especially recently with the rise in popularity of RFK Jr., anti-vaxxers seem to be obsessed with randomized controlled trials. They seem to be obsessed with finding out where are the original trials for all the childhood vaccines, which they exist. Every single vaccine was trialed before being approved on and put on the market. But they are obsessed with this idea that they were never initially properly tested. But I want to just say, let's say they never were. Let's say that they're right and that they never were, but they were. How do we still know that they're safe? Well, after a phase 3 trial, we go immediately into phase 4, which is indefinite, and that's pharmacovigilance or surveillance trials. So what ends up happening is once a vaccine is rolled out, you get doses into millions of people. And at that stage, you can see very rare events happening. So in a phase 3 trial, when you have, say, 40,000 individuals, half of which get a vaccine and half of which don't, you will see whether or not the vaccine is effective in that group, and you'll get some sense of how often people get serious adverse events. But if you're looking for a 1 in a million event, you're not going to detect that in a phase 3 trial. You're only going to detect that in a phase 4 surveillance trial. So when you think about how long we've had childhood vaccines around and how long they've been in these phase 4 trials, how long not just the US, but every single country that administers them has been monitoring their safety. You get a massive amount and very long established safety profile. And that is much more powerful than any phase 3 trial for the reasons I just stated. You're not going to detect rare events. And even if you do, it might not be statistically significant. But suddenly when you have millions of events or billions of events in the case of COVID vaccines of doses being given around the world, you can start to really establish a good safety profile and be confident that your drug or product is doing what it's supposed to do and not causing serious adverse events. So just to mention a little bit more about these phase 4 trials, people might say, oh, there's no control group. Well, yeah, there is. There's always unvaccinated people that you can compare to, but there's also always a baseline of adverse events that you can compare whatever group of vaccinated individuals you are studying. So, for example, if suddenly you see a rise in a particular adverse event like myocarditis, which we saw with Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines, you can measure that. You can see, okay, we expect this many cases in this many people. Oh, there's a slight signal here. Let's investigate further and figure out whether or not it's real. Okay, it's real. You can do that very systematically with these phase 4 trials in a way you can't do with phase 3 trials. So this obsession with phase 3 trials or randomized controlled trials is very misguided, but I think purposeful by the anti-vaccine industry to mislead people into thinking that vaccines were never properly tested, when in reality we have a massive amount of safety data.
I like what you said there too, that mentioned it as the anti-vaccine industry, because it is indeed an absolute industry that makes a lot of money off of their propaganda. I want to turn what you said over to the panel for further comments, but before I do, I wanted to know if you could clarify for any listeners the difference between long-term adverse events and latent long-term adverse events, because I think that's something where that nuance doesn't really get teased out enough in the popular discussion about this.
Yeah, so I think you're asking about, a lot of anti-vaxxers have this concern about what are the long-term effects. You see that a lot with COVID vaccines. What are the effects going to be in 5 years or 10 years? But really, Paul Offit's CHOP the Paul Offit's hospital CHOP has a lot of resources online about this, and a particular article called Long-Term Side Effects of COVID-19 Vaccine, What We Know. And it goes through the history of adverse events to vaccines. And the point is that pretty much every single adverse event following a vaccine is going to occur within the first 8 weeks after the dose is given. And that has remained true for, correct me if I'm wrong, but every single adverse event that we know of caused by vaccines, including COVID vaccines. And the reason there is that adverse events are usually caused by your immune response. If it's not anaphylaxis or some ingredient in the vaccine, it's caused by your own immune response, having a secondary adverse event. But after 8 weeks, your immune response to that initial dose has completed and you have immune memory, ideally. So after that point, there's really nothing content-wise in the vaccine or that your body's doing that's going to cause an adverse event from that vaccine being given. So I think that answers your question, but
yeah, perfect. Thank you.
It's not really, yeah.
Yeah, we're a little over on time. Does the panel, we have about a minute left that we can spare. Does the panel want to comment on any of Dr. Wilson's his fact or his myth?
I just wanted to thank Dr. Wilson for making it so clear, and just to remind everybody that this is a current issue, not just for COVID-19 vaccine, but the anti-vaccine organization ICAN is now challenging the licensing of polio vaccine, inactivated polio vaccine, claiming the lack of placebo trials. So setting out the facts is really helpful, both not just for COVID, but also for routine childhood vaccine.
I mean, yeah, that's just ridiculous to hear. When polio vaccines were famously in a randomized placebo, and the placebo there is saline controlled trial involving hundreds of thousands of kids in America. 200,000?
Yeah,
so it's 420,000 got the vaccine, 200,000 got placebo. Yeah, and 1.2 million observed on inoculated controls. It was probably the biggest trial of any medical product ever, and it was placebo controlled. True, but I think they're suing Sanofi, right, for IPOL, right, because yes, they didn't test that product against the placebo, which tells you exactly how cruel I think some of these people are. They actually would be willing to subject children to a placebo control, knowing that virus still circulates. Certainly the revertant virus, the vaccine derived polio virus still circulates in this community. Somebody died, got polio last year in New York in this country. Yes. So, but they'd be willing to subject children to a placebo control trial, knowing that the vaccine works and that it's safe, because this newer version of Sanofi's product hasn't been tested in placebo control trial.
Exactly, that's the argument, that the new version, and as you're saying, the risks they're willing to take is that children get polio in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
It's ridiculous. It's like asking if a cancer patient were to, if you want to test a new cancer drug, and you have a group of cancer patients that are not going to get the drug and a group of cancer patients that are going to get the drug. It's like asking the control group to have no standard of care because they're a control group. They can't have any standard of care. That's ridiculous. You establish that polio vaccines are safe and effective, and that's the standard of care. And then if you have a better vaccine, because scientists are always trying to make vaccines better and safer, then why would you deny children that established standard of care? It doesn't make any sense.
Dr. Wilson, thank you for that. And I have to second Dr. Rice's opinion that you did an amazing job of clarifying something that is a really complicated issue. I'm going to pass this over to Dave again to bring in our next speaker.
Thanks, John. I just want to say I wish I could say I'm surprised that ICAN wants to make polio great again, but unfortunately that is very much on brand for them. So I'm not in the slightest bit surprised at all. So our next speaker is Victoria Shaheen. Victoria is Senior Director at a clinical research organization. Her fact is that pertussis is a preventable disease which is on the rise, and vaccines are our best tool to prevent it. Her myth is that vaccines can lead to infertility. So over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for having me. Being cognizant of time, I can actually cut my fact down pretty quickly, especially because of the groundwork that's been laid by the discussion today. So, with the relaxing of COVID-19 vaccine mandates and the, removal of the public health emergency, anecdotally, I've personally observed a lot more attacks on the regular schedule of vaccines. Led by the major influencers, who do benefit financially from, undermining public confidence in vaccines in order to sell supplements and books and Substack subscriptions and tours and affiliate links, just a few. And pertussis, whooping cough, is actually something that we, can look at over history and see it's a brutal disease, one of the leading causes of death in children, prior to the vaccine being introduced. We can see a direct line of when the vaccine was introduced in the early 30s and just an absolute plummeting of cases. And then that's actually starting to tick up again. So just a couple, facts about pertussis. So it is actually caused by a bacteria. So shifting away from viruses, it is Bordetella pertussis. And the disease itself is actually caused by the toxin, a couple of toxins in the bacteria. It's also a very specific disease, so it will replicate only, sort of deep in the ciliated epithelium of the lungs. Your cilia are like, these little hairs that kind of push mucus and dust and everything out of the respiratory tract. So the toxin damages those, resulting in, buildup of all of that kind of gunk, for lack of a better word. I'm not a clinician, so just a microbiologist. It is a brutal disease, though. And what scares me personally about it, as someone with a young child, is that the symptom onset tends to be very mild. So just a runny nose, kind of watery eyes, no fever, or if there is a fever, a very low one. So, it's not really going to be raising the red flags for parents necessarily, or physicians. But then the next phase, the paroxysmal phase, is, things get really bad really fast. So a mild cough starts to worsen in frequency and severity. Patients are known to, cough so hard that they turn hypoxic. They, run out of oxygen. They turn blue. They can cough out a hernia, crack a rib. And I should mention that we're, the most vulnerable patients to this disease are, elderly, immunocompromised, but really tiny infants who are under the age of 2 months, too young to be vaccinated. So, these symptoms take on a whole new level of horror when you're thinking about them in a tiny baby. So in the 40s, a vaccine was introduced, and quickly cases plummeted. I think in the US, there were several 100,000 cases per year, 5,000 to 8,000 deaths per year from whooping cough after the vaccine. In, I want to say, the 80s, that rate had dropped by almost 99% to just a few thousand cases per year. That being said, that early vaccine was a whole cell vaccine, so it was a killed bacterium. And over the decades, there was resistance and vaccine hesitancy that built up to that vaccine, to the point where in the 80s, 90s, cases of pertussis had started to tick up again due to a relaxed, uptake, and decreased uptake and decreased coverage. So, just to kind of go through the timeline, hundreds of thousands of cases and thousands of deaths in the United States prior to the vaccine. By the into the 40s, pertussis still a leading cause of death in young children. And by the mid 70s, it was almost a medical anomaly. There were so few cases in the United States. You may be surprised to hear that in 2018, there were 15,000 cases in the United States and 5 deaths. These were preventable from the vaccine. So I think, when we discuss, especially in public, or if we're communicating or having these discussions, I think there's a tendency, when you think about children dying from preventable diseases, vaccine preventable disease, there's a tendency to almost like imagine them in black and white, like they're from the 1700s or 1800s, right? And that just, that just isn't the case. So, we run a real risk if we allow further efforts to undermine confidence in regularly scheduled vaccines to continue to see those cases rising throughout the world. I should mention also that in the 90s, we switched over to an acellular vaccine. So just a vaccine that is made with the toxins of the bacteria. So it's not quite as effective and doesn't provide as durable a level of immunity as the whole cell vaccine, but it was creating less adverse events. And it was actually designed in response to the growing vaccine hesitancy of the whole cell vaccine. So because of that, there is a need for boosters about every 10 years. And as I mentioned, infants being under the age of 2 months, being vulnerable, pregnant women are offered and hopefully would take advantage of the fact that you can safely get this DTaP vaccine, which is diphtheria, tetanus and acellular pertussis in the 3rd trimester, and it does confer immunity to the infant for, I believe, about 6 months. And by then, the infant would be, I think, 3/4 of the way vaccinated. The schedule in the US is pertussis vaccine at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, and I think 15 months. So my concern is that, further erosion of confidence in vaccines that was, the anti-COVID vaccine misinformation served as a springboard for is going to have, real world impact on our children, elderly, immunocompromised patients, and that it's totally preventable. And that I don't know that pertussis will ever go away, even though it is vaccine preventable. But unless we all get vaccinated, we all have to do our part to build herd immunity and continue to work on more effective vaccines. So that's my fact.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who'd like to add a little more to that before we move on to the myth?
I don't think pertussis will ever go away. I think even if 100% of the population were vaccinated against pertussis, I still think the bacteria would circulate and at least cause mild disease. I mean, the goal is to, again, prevent severe disease. This is the problem with mucosal infections. I guess I'm biased or like permanently harmed by working 26 years on a rotavirus vaccine, which is another short incubation period mucosal infection. I mean, we've dramatically reduced hospitalizations in the US, but that virus still circulates in the community, despite the fact there's 90 to 95% immunization, and there's still mild disease in the community. We'll never change that. I think it'd be true with COVID too. Even if that virus never developed variants and everybody was vaccinated, I think it would still circulate and cause mild disease.
Yeah, and this is precisely why, I really dislike the anti-vaxxer line of, well, if your vaccine works for you, why do I have to take it? I think, the destruction of collective immunity or herd immunity that's the result. I mean, everybody has to get vaccinated in order to keep these horrible diseases at bay.
The point that you've made quite strongly there is that there is a cascading effect of anti-vax propaganda. If they can weaken confidence in one vaccine, it leads to a loss of confidence in other vaccines. And then we get a snowball effect in which the negative health effects start to accumulate quite rapidly before people are really aware of it. And then before you know it, you've got a potentially a localized public health crisis on your hands, depending on how widely that's spread or whether specific demographics have been targeted, which is something we know anti-vaxxers do quite deliberately. They look for demographics they believe to be vulnerable for whatever reason, and then they immediately ply them with as much propaganda as possible. And the next thing you know, oh, we've got an outbreak in this demographic. Who's been talking to them lately? Oh, it was Andrew Wakefield. No surprise at all. So yes, I think that's a very valid concern that you've raised. And it is something we have actually seen in recent years. So then if we can proceed to your myth then, the idea that vaccines can lead to infertility. And on that point, why do people think they can lead to infertility, and what mechanism would be involved?
Great. Well, I will address that. And I may ask Dr. Dan to jump in if you want to talk really about, protein structure, but I'm not going to get that deep into it. But basically, from what I can understand, this myth originated in late 2020, December 2020. And the actual myth is the head researcher at Pfizer has called for the halting to vaccine trials because he is concerned that there are similarities between the spike protein that the vaccine is targeting and placental protein. So his rationale, without any evidence at all, was that the vaccine against the spike protein could target the placenta, damage it, and lead to infertility. He went so far as to file, an emergency request with the European Medicines Agency to, stop the vaccine trials. And he was thankfully unsuccessful. As I mentioned, he provided no evidence. So as far as the debunking, first of all, the head researcher at Pfizer is not a thing. So Michael Yeadon was a vice president in allergy and respiratory research. So, I think that the head of Pfizer, or the head researcher of Pfizer, it's really a childlike viewpoint of how these organizations are structured. I mean, there are probably thousands of vice presidents at Pfizer. And so, and not only that, he actually left the company in 2011 and was not involved in the development of vaccines at all. So, on top of that, when actual scientists, evaluated that claim, they found that no, there wasn't enough similarities between, I think there may have been an overlap of just a few amino acids, but it wasn't enough to cause any type of cross-reactivity. So it would be like comparing a square to a triangle. So both of those things have sides, they both have angles, but they are in no way the same thing. So that really should have just killed that myth, but it didn't. So, and it really started to gain traction online and in doctors' offices. A lot of OBGYNs and, fertility specialists were fielding these questions from patients. Should I take this vaccine? I heard it causes, infertility. So, scientists got to work on debunking it, doing actual research and observational studies. And so, one of the first pieces of information that came out was that the rates of pregnancy in the clinical trials were similar in the control group versus the active vaccine group. So, if indeed the vaccine led to infertility, you would expect to see a much lower number of pregnancies in the vaccine group. And that was not the case. So again, it was an opportunity for this myth to die. Another really excellent source of information to debunk this myth actually came from fertility clinics. We have now loads of observational data because fertility indicators are so closely monitored and tracked and recorded by fertility clinics. So what I mean by that is, sperm quality, motility, morphology, egg quality, embryo quality. And across the globe, in every community where fertility services are available, no such deleterious effects on these fertility parameters were detected. In fact, rates of fertility treatments have risen, not necessarily due to the vaccine, technology is improving, et cetera, but there have not been a reduction in people seeking and being successful with their fertility treatments. So on top of that, there have also been histopathology studies done on the placentas of women who were vaccinated and who were not. And there was no detection of damaging effects to the placenta in vaccinated women. And in fact, it has been suggested that viral infection can cause placental injury. So, overall, there's absolutely no evidence that even suggests that COVID vaccines can contribute to infertility anyway. The initial mechanism of harm, the similarity of the proteins, was completely debunked right away. In fact, and I'm no risk assessment expert, but I would say that the greatest threat to fertility when it comes to COVID is actually dying of COVID. So, or having severe infection such that you're left, with some sort of disability. And also, interestingly enough, because cells in the testes do have ACE2 receptors, it is possible for the virus, to be found in the testes. But not only that, fevers can impact spermatogenesis. And so, of course, one of the hallmark symptoms of COVID is a fever, sometimes very high fever. And so some fertility experts have suggested that, this could impact a spermatogenic cycle in a male who is infected with COVID. So not only is the myth untrue, but it has the added bonus of actually minimizing the harm that can come from actually getting infected. So that's my it's my myth, and it's insidious. And I will actually, I'm sorry, I will add that families who are dealing with infertility, it is stressful, it is emotionally fraught. It's not something that you can just switch off. It can become all-consuming, and it really leaves people, I think, susceptible to anything that either builds hope or takes it away. And so that's one of the reasons I find this myth to be so damaging. And every time it's debunked, it seems like a newer and more unhinged version of it comes out. So it's like, okay, all of a sudden having sexual intercourse with someone who is vaccinated is going to harm your fertility, or children that you have years down the line are going to be infertile because of the vaccine that you got. It is made up out of whole cloth. There's no evidence for it, and I find it very difficult to debunk myths that are not based in fact at all. It's really difficult to debunk fiction with facts.
Dr. Mail, if you want to jump in, I've just got a follow-up.
Yeah, I would just love to hop in and talk about a paper that's really important for so many of the things that you've mentioned there, which is from Amelia Westling. She's the first author, and it was published at the beginning of 2022 in the American Journal of Epidemiology. So you mentioned the possibility, first of all, that COVID infection can cause reduced fertility in males because of fever impacting on the testes and potentially infecting the testes. And actually in that paper, they showed that male fertility is reduced for a couple of months after COVID infection. Thankfully, it does seem to recover, but I think this is really worth people knowing. It's not just a theoretical possibility that COVID impacts male fertility. There is evidence that it impacts male fertility. Although I should say there's not actually evidence in that paper that it impacts female fertility. And the other thing that I really love about this paper from Westling is that you mentioned so much of the data from fertility clinics, and actually most of the data that we have about the lack of COVID vaccination impacting fertility is from fertility clinics for all the reasons that you explained. But so often when I'm talking to people about COVID vaccination and fertility, they say, well, these people in fertility clinics, they're going there for some reason. I'm not going to a fertility clinic. What about people who are just having sex? And the thing that I love about the Westling paper as well is that they're following 2,000 couples who are just having sex. And they find that if you are just having sex, if you are vaccinated or if you're not vaccinated, or actually the comparison they do is how likely you are to get pregnant each month, contributing to unvaccinated time and vaccinated time as you change, there's no difference in the chance that you'll become pregnant. And I think that this piece of evidence is something that people find really reassuring. And actually, while I'm chatting about papers, another one that I think is another three that I think are really worth mentioning is specifically with respect to this claim that anti-spike antibodies would recognize the placental protein syncytium-1. Three groups did actually, with no money, go and see if that was true, not because scientifically there was any reason to believe it was true. As you've mentioned, the proteins are not the same at all, but just in response to public interest, the public, being concerned about this. And all three of these, completely as expected, find that there's no cross-reactivity between anti-spike antibodies able to recognize this placental protein. So I think this is another thing that can sometimes be quite useful to talk to people about if they're worried about this very specific one myth that started it all off. Of course, as you've said, it kind of morphs, and vaccine and fertility, not just COVID vaccines, have been a thing for a long time. We probably don't have time to talk about why that is, but it's a really interesting topic for sure.
What do we do when an anti-vaxxer comes and says, well, I've seen the package insert for this particular vaccine, and it clearly says this vaccine has not been tested for mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, or impairment of fertility?
Oh, I send them to Dorit because she's an attorney, and I think vaccine inserts are written by attorneys and intended for attorneys.
Send them to Vaxopedia, which has a really nice short summary of that specific claim.
Sorry, I typically go through a summary of, because I work in for a clinical research organization, so we support clinical trials. So typically I do go through a summary of the phases of clinical trials, what the aims are, what the population of subjects is generally included, and sort of a little bit of the history of pregnant people not being included in trials, and how this situation with COVID has opened the conversation about that. Whether or not, well, certainly there's a lot of ethical concerns around it, but also when you're in an active pandemic that we are seeing, can put a pregnancy at risk, whether or not that should be considered.
I just wanted to say thank you, Tori, for covering this. For a while, I thought that this issue was one of the most harmful and most frustrating things about the pandemic, because, as you said, there was literally no evidence for this. And we could talk for a while about some of the papers that Vicky mentioned. I'm looking at one right now, and yeah, the similarities between syncytin 1 and spike were nothing to write home about. You could probably find those similarities if you compare most proteins. But I will just add that this Mike Eden guy is pretty unhinged. Recently was saying things like there was never a virus. And he also was calling for the Nuremberg 2, the execution of doctors and scientists. So that's who he is. But because he has letters in front of his name, he could just say something that tapped into a fear that reasonable people might have. And we have to clean up the mess as science communicators. So yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you for that topic. I agree. It's a really, really pernicious issue. So we're gonna bring our final speaker on, who probably needs little introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. We have Dr. Paul Offit, who is the director of Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as the Maurice R. Hillman Professor of Vaccinology and Professor of Pediatrics at the Perlman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And Dr. Offit has, for his 2013 book, Do You Believe in Magic?, has won the Robert P. Bales Prize for Excellence in Critical Thinking, which is probably my favorite prize you could have won. So congratulations on that. And we're going to pivot a little from what we've been discussing. And for his fact, Dr. Offit is going to talk about that SARS-CoV-2 was an animal to human spillover event that took place in the western section of the Hunan wholesale seafood market in Wuhan, China at the end of 2019. And for his myth, he's going to be discussing SARS-CoV-2 was created to target certain ethnic and religious groups. So thank you for being here, Dr. Offit, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
So I have 6 points to make on the issue of whether or not SARS-CoV-2 was an animal to human spillover event, which it was. So number one, photographs taken of the western section of the Hunan seafood wholesale market showed raccoon dogs and a red fox, both of which are known to be infected with SARS-CoV-2. A customer at the market, knowing it was illegal to sell certain wild animals, took those photos on December 3rd, 2019, and posted them on Weibo, a Chinese microblogging website. The photos were immediately deleted, but not before a CNN reporter was able to pass them on to scientists in the United States. Two, in that same area of the market, SARS-CoV-2 was detected in carts, drains, a feather and hair remover, a metal cage, and machines that process animals after they've been slaughtered. Three, the first known human case of COVID occurred on December 10th, 2019, and a female vendor at the Hunan market. Two of the first three cases had direct contact with the western section of that market. Indeed, more than half of the early cases had direct or indirect exposure to the Hunan market. Wuhan is a city of 11 million people. There are probably 10,000 places where a new virus could have arisen. Nonetheless, the first cluster of cases were restricted to the western section of a market that was selling live animals susceptible to the virus, exactly where you'd have expected a spillover event to occur. The estimated chance that this pattern had occurred randomly and not as a direct result of animals infecting people is about 1 in 10 million. The Hunan seafood wholesale market is located north of the Yangtze River, about 9 miles from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is south of the river. If the pandemic virus leaked from the Wuhan Institute, it would have had to have leapt across the river without infecting anyone in between. Fifth, the emergence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus bears a striking resemblance to SARS-CoV-1 spillover events from animals to humans that occurred in Guangdong province in China in 2002. 2002, and again in 2003. Finally, on March 17th, 2023, a discovery by three prominent researchers, Michael Warby, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Arizona, Christian Anderson, who's a virologist at Scripps Research Institute in California, and Eddie Holmes, a biologist at the University of Sydney, should have ended the controversy. Examining samples from the Hunan seafood market, first taken in January 2020, the international research team found genetic evidence for SARS-CoV-2 in raccoon dogs that have been sold illegally, further proving the origin of the virus. So I think the most amazing aspect of this is that 2/3 of the American public still thinks this is a lab leak. You have people like Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, testifying in front of Congress that this is a likely event. You have people like the Department of Energy standing up in front of Congress and saying the same thing. And Marty Macri, who's a pancreatic surgeon at Johns Hopkins, also gets up in front of Congress and says the same thing. It's hard to watch. This one, an animal to human spillover event. That's what it was. But, conspiracy cells, as Dan and Arit and all of us well know, and that's much more interesting than the animal to human spillover event.
And what do you think drives those ideas? Why is it important to focus more on what scientists are saying than what the director of the DOJ, for example, is saying?
I mean, we like simple solutions to problems. We'd like to believe that the problems are controllable, and maybe it's that we think that we're an evildoer at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Maybe that's more controllable than the randomness that comes with this. First of all, animal to human spillover events occur all the time. I mean, that they often don't click into the human population the way this did, but they occur all the time. There were actually two lineages of SARS-CoV-2 that were initially created. One of them sort of predominated, but there were two lineages. This happens all the time. It's like I guess the analogy would be climbing Everest. I mean, there were a lot of people that tried to climb Everest, and then someone sort of finally got there, but there's a lot that are always trying to get there. So this is not surprising, and maybe it's because it's less controllable. It's funny, when I wrote a book about the Cutter incident, which was a polio vaccine made badly, and when I was talking to scientists at the time, trying to figure out what happened to Cutter Labs that allowed them to essentially make a polio vaccine that contained live virulent polio virus, there was among scientists a belief that there were people at Cutter that knew that there was a problem, which wasn't true. First of all, people that were in manufacturing vaccinated their own children, so they didn't know there was a problem. But somehow that seemed better because that seemed more controllable. Like the other companies that are better companies aren't going to ever let something like that happen. But it was much more complicated than that, and that's was more frightening, I guess, less controllable. But I deferred to others about why.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say an idea that I think I learned from Dr. Steve Novella, a neurologist at Yale. This idea that big events have to have big causes. For example, I think it was him who made this idea that there's a ton of John F. Kennedy shooting conspiracies, of course, because it was this massive event. But there are no conspiracies about the Ronald Reagan attempted shooting, because in the scheme of things, it turned out to be a blip in history. But had the bullet been, an inch to the side, it would have hit Reagan in the heart and he would have died. And we would be hearing 100 conspiracies about, John F. Hinckley, this mentally ill man, got close enough to President Reagan to shoot him in the heart. Are you kidding me? You believe that sort of thing? So I think human beings have a hard time accepting that this biggest event of our lifetime, COVID, it came from this random corner of this random seafood market in a city none of us, or probably very few of us, had heard of before the pandemic.
There is, of course, the element of racist hostility towards China. That wasn't helped by the fact that they tried to not share data for such a long time. So that probably also fits into that.
Yeah, and I'll add, as someone who used to believe a lot of conspiracy theories when I was in high school, I think what Paul said about just the chaoticness being scarier and wanting a simpler explanation is spot on, because, if you accept the reality that, yeah, there is a constant risk of animal to human spillover of potentially very dangerous viruses, that can be pretty scary. We can think about solutions to it, but the solutions are relatively complicated, right? Because it has to do with, our relationship with nature and how we treat animals and how we have these huge meat industries that have unsafe practices. All of that affects the likelihood of animal to human spillover, and the solutions are complicated. But if you instead believe, oh, it came from a lab and it was these researchers who did this, then you immediately identify those are the bad guys, and the solution is to attack them and take away their funding and paint them as the villains. It's a relatively simpler solution that can seem attractive to a lot of people. So I think that's why a lot of people it's part of the reason why a lot of people choose to believe that, I think.
And I think as a follow-up question for Dr. Offit on this, do you think that we hear a lot of stuff about the mainstream narrative or what the MSM is pushing and whatnot? Do you think that rational scientific voices are properly represented in the media on this issue? And if so, do you think that might be a reason why people's beliefs on this particular issue are so skewed?
I think the media's job is to be interesting and to ultimately sell advertising, and that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that, and it's also, I think Dorit makes a very good point that there was secrecy. The Chinese government was not quick to let people come in, scientists come in and examine what was going on, and that only made conspiracies all the more likely. So I think that we didn't. And also, the truth is, I mean, Dr. Sheng Jing Li, who was the head of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, did do gain of function studies. Technically, by the definition of gain of function studies, she actually did it. She took WIV1, which is not a virus that easily infects humans, and then she made reassortant viruses between a gnat and 8 other bat strains, but no function was gained. So gain of function research was done, no gain of function was gained. I mean, technically, we made reassortant rotaviruses between bovine reassortants, both bovine viruses, a bovine virus, and human viruses. That technically was gain of function research. I mean, no function was gained. In fact, function was lost, which is what became the vaccine. But the way that was defined initially, and I felt badly for Dr. Fauci when he was testifying in front of Rand Paul and others, where he said that there wasn't gain of function. Technically, there actually was. And so it was a mess, because getting people to understand that gain of function research can be done without gaining function, I think, made it all the harder to explain. So it was a mess, I think, early on. And I think it's hard to explain, but conspiracy always sells much better. And if you don't believe the media loves people who are interesting, just watch the way they're covering Vivek Ramaswamy now, if you really want to get nauseated.
No, I think that's a great segue, because your myth actually covers one of the topics that I always find fascinating, which is that we get a lot of stuff from the anti-vaxxers where they want us to fear a safe and effective vaccine, but they do not fear a man-made virus, which is just something I can never wrap my head around that one. So your myth that SARS-CoV-2 was created to target certain ethnic and religious groups. I really like this topic. Can you get into that for us?
Yeah, so briefly. So this sort of was born, at least to me, by an event, a fundraising event for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in a New York City Italian restaurant, when he sort of casually said that, that this virus was created, quote, I don't know whether it was deliberately or not, that targets certain groups like Blacks and Caucasians, but spares groups like Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. And he kept referring to a paper, which is what I find so cynical about all this. He goes, well, just read the paper. You don't have to trust me. Just read the paper, which nobody does, including him, presumably, because if he read the paper, he wouldn't have come to that conclusion. I mean, the paper basically was a study out of the Cleveland Clinic where they examined 80,000 human genomes trying to predict. And remember, this work was done in early 2020, before the virus really started sweeping across this country and causing people to be hospitalized and die. So it was a prediction paper that ended up not being right at all. But they basically predicted based on sort of genetic polymorphisms of two surface proteins, ACE2, and then this sort of temperous, serine protease, that who would be susceptible and who wouldn't. But the population frequencies for some of these polymorphisms was 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, not the kind of thing that ever would be seen as a population effect. I mean, it may predict an individual's risk, but not at a population level. And it didn't. I mean, who got hospitalized and killed? Really based on age, comorbidities, vaccination status, and others, but not whether or not you were an Ashkenazi Jew, which I actually am. Nonetheless, got COVID, I'd like to point out, so it's not perfect, and as is Dorit. So also, I like the way that he sort of distinguished Ashkenazi Jews from Caucasians. I don't know, I always thought Jews were white, but who knows? I mean, sorry. That's John Stewart's joke. So in any case, he referred to that paper, which didn't say that at all, and it sort of brings up a bigger subject for me, which is this notion that what Kennedy will often say is he'll say, don't have to trust me, just trust the science, but it gets to that whole sort of public library of science. I mean, on the one hand, you do want people to be informed. You want them to be shared decision makers. On the other hand, what's the chance that people can really understand that? When the chickenpox vaccine came out, for example, I'll give you a dramatic example. When the chickenpox vaccine came out in 1995, uptake was really low. First couple of years, maybe 10% of people who were recommended to receive it, which was all children in this country, actually got it. And when people would call me, they would say, I've done my research and I've decided not to get the vaccine. But what does doing your research really mean? What it meant to them was looking on the internet and looking at other people's opinions. I mean, if you really wanted to do your research on that vaccine at that time, mid-90s, you should have read the roughly couple hundred papers that were on that vaccine or on the virus. How did this vaccine virus differ genetically from wild-type virus? How was this virus constructed? What data do we have on its safety, efficacy, et cetera? Well, most people aren't going to read those studies. Most doctors aren't going to read those studies. I mean, ultimately, who does read the studies? At least collectively, most of the people on the advisory committees will have at least read those studies or have an expertise on those studies. And often when these committees, I know on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, will bring in experts, on that subject. Like when we talk about dengue, we'll bring dengue experts onto the committee who at least collectively have read those studies. And, but try selling that message in the 21st century, right? Trust us, we're experts. I mean, it doesn't work. So on the one hand, you want people to be informed. On the other hand, how do they get informed? They get informed by people like Dan Wilson. That's how I choose to have them be informed.
Okay, well, we are a bit past time, so I'll wrap this up. Thank you, everyone for joining us today. I think we had a really productive conversation and covered a lot of ground. And having you guys here is a great pleasure and a great honor. And I really can't thank everybody enough. Dave, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, just to reiterate your thanks. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to have all of you here together. And it was definitely worth staying up all night for, which is exactly what I've done.
For arranging it and having us up.
Yes.
Absolutely.